Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh. A'udhu billahi minash shaitanir rajim. Bismillahir rahmanir rahim. Ashhadu an la ilaha illallah wa ashhadu anna Muhammadar Rasulullah sallallahu alayhi wa sallam. I'd just like to begin by thanking the Universitas Muhammadiyya and everyone who's been involved in organizing the seminar for doing such a wonderful job and for welcoming everyone. I think it's been very interesting for all of us. And this is a subject matter which there are different opinions and different views, and it's important that everybody is heard. But one of the things I'd like to do in my talk is to kind of bring together matters which are not often considered together, and in order perhaps to make connections that people aren't used to making. I'm reminded of an event that happened in Cape Town a few months ago. I was in the marketplace and just looking at some of the goods, and then someone bumped into me on my right-hand side. And as I turned around, I could feel someone going into my top pocket here, so I quickly put my hand over my heart and saved my mobile phone. But this technique not only happens in the marketplace, in a little marketplace, but it happens in the big marketplace of the world, that people are distracted so that they can be deprived of their possessions. And this is something that we see happening more and more in this time. And it's very important to read the times, to be able to read what is happening. We come into this world, we're not always aware what's happened before, we can't always see what's coming. But if we're prudent, we try and assess what situation we're in. We are in an ocean of existence. What are the main currents? What are the storms? Where is the shallow water? Where are the hidden rocks? Where is the safe passageway? We have to navigate a way through life. And if we don't do this, then the danger is that when we come to study, we will study one thing in one compartment and another thing in another compartment. So we'll look at the fiqh of muamala in one compartment. We'll look at modern banking in another compartment. We'll look at what the politician's doing in another compartment, and we don't always make connections which in fact are very necessary if we are to read the times, if we are to understand what exactly is happening. Because certainly in the media, we're not always given a true, accurate picture. There's so much disinformation in the media today that often we have so much information and then we don't know what to make of it. We don't know what is true and what's not true, and what's half true and what's completely false. And so it makes it even more difficult to make a judgment that is accurate. I wanted to look, first of all, because looking at the title of my topic, and I have got a handout, which inshallah you all have copies of. I won't be reading it out, I'll just be referring to it. And you'll find that there's things in the handout which I won't talk about, and things I'll talk about which aren't in the handout. I think Abdurrahman is translating. Sorry, Bismillah. Okay. So, first of all, I'd like to look at rulership in Europe and America. In other words, outside the traditional Muslim lands. And if we go back in time, we find that there was personal rule, and after the coming of Sayyidina Isa, when Christianity, which was not what he originally taught, but a kind of reformed version, came to Europe, you found that all the rulers were kings or queens. They had personal rule. And they even took the liberty of saying that they were there by divine appointment, and therefore whatever they said was the law. And so it wasn't long before an unjust king was so unjust that people said, we need protection. This is the history of the Magna Carta in England, that people said we can't just have things taken from us. If we're imprisoned, we should be charged or we should be set free. And if we're charged, we should have a fair trial. These very basic rights that people hope to enjoy in their lives. And that was the situation for a while, but then we saw a change. And the change was that gradually the personal rule was replaced by constitutional rule. Sorry. Okay, sorry.
Jadi kita melihat bahwa pada sejarah baik di Amerika maupun di Eropa, bahkan sejak zaman Sayyidina Isa, kepemimpinan selalu berbentuk kepemimpinan personal. Pada saat itu raja-raja banyak di Eropa, dan apa yang menjadi kata raja adalah titah, ya, menjadi hukum. Sampai kemudian sekelompok orang menyatakan bahwa kita tidak bisa hidup dalam sistem seperti ini. Kita perlu perlindungan lebih terhadap hak-hak kita, terutama saat kita dituduh atau diadili, kita perlu semacam perlindungan hukum tanda kutip, dan oleh karenanya lahirlah Magna Carta. Dan dari situ kemudian berkembang model kepemimpinan yang kita kenal sekarang ini.
There was a very interesting development in this because while there were still kings and queens, inevitably there were wars, and they needed to finance the wars. And they would do this by taxing the local population to raise funds, but also they would borrow. And we see really in the 18th, 19th centuries the development of the banking system and the beginning of the national debt. And so, for example, with England, the original loan was for £1 million, but it was structured in such a way that it would never be repaid.
Jadi pada masa raja dan ratu ini, tentu secara fitrah ada peperangan. Dan untuk membiayai peperangan, biasanya dilakukan pemajakan terhadap penduduk. Tapi di saat yang bersamaan juga mereka meminjam uang untuk mendanai perang, dan disinilah terjadi timbulnya lahirnya perbankan. Ya.
And once parliamentary rule,
dan yang lebih menakutkannya adalah pinjaman yang diberikan oleh pihak-pihak perbankan ini didesain sehingga tidak bisa dibayar sampai sekarang.
And once parliamentary rule was established, and as the development of the modern armaments syndrome was developed, it wasn't possible to get all the money just from taxing people. And therefore the government started to borrow from the banks. And so this increased the national debt, it didn't decrease it.
Dan kemudian sejalan dengan berkembangnya sistem parlementer, teknologi militer, ini mengakibatkan para raja dan ratu ini harus meminjam lebih banyak lagi.
So I have two quotations on the second page of my handout. And the first is this. This is from a book, an essay by Hajj Abdullah Luongo about Ezra Pound, who was very critical of usury in his lifetime. And he says, talking about the time of kings, there was one such financier who occupied a privileged place in the court of Louis XIV of France. A chronicler from the period said of him that he could often be seen walking in the garden with the king, that he supported the state like the rope supports the hanging man. So the banking system was supporting the king, but like this. He had a noose round his neck.
Jadi sebagaimana yang ada dalam makalah saya dan dijelaskan di sini dari buku yang ditulis oleh Haji Abdullah Luongo yang mengutip dari Ezra Pound. Ezra Pound adalah seorang penulis yang kritis terhadap persoalan ini. Jadi petikannya sebagai berikut. Pada satu saat hiduplah seorang pemodal, ya, seorang bankir yang menguasai dan memiliki kekuasaan yang khusus di lingkaran terdalam Raja Louis ke-14 dari Perancis. Dan yang dicatat mengenai orang ini adalah dia bisa dilihat selalu berjalan-jalan di taman bersama sang raja.
I think
Dan
actually,
dia mendukung kerajaan, tapi layaknya tali yang menggantung di orang yang akan dihukum gantung.
yeah. I'm sorry if I have to keep on stopping for translation. I'm not going to have time to cover the ground. So I think the best thing is I'll just speak in English, and inshallah the people who understand can explain to the people whose English isn't as good as my Bahasa should be. Inshallah, if you'll forgive me, because otherwise there won't be time. Okay, thank you. So, the second quotation I wanted, also on the second page of my handout, is a bit further on. This is in the 19th century. And he quotes, by far the most notorious name in banking, having established themselves as moneylenders early on in European history, was that of the house of Rothschild. When a certain Mr. Rothschild, descendant of this ingenious family, finally crossed the Atlantic to America, he was asked if he was going to become king of America. His answer is most significant. He said, "Give me control of the issuing of money and credit, and I care not who sits in the house of politics." So in other words, you see the transition of power going from personal rulership and from parliament, from constitutional parliament, to the bankers. And of course, no one has elected them. They have never stood for election, but they are the ones who begin to wield control. And they do this by getting countries into debt. For example, in England, as I mentioned, the original debt was £1 million. The national debt now is over £900 billion. So in a very short time, it's got to such a size that it will never be repaid. And it's a control mechanism. It's a control mechanism. Now, I want to look at the Muslim governance. Because time is so short, I'm having to paraphrase a lot. If we look at the history of Muslim governance, it's a very different picture. Because after the Rasul died, sallallahu alaihi wasallam, he appointed Abu Bakr as the Khalif. And there was no argument about this. And then before Abu Bakr died, he chose Sidna Umar. And when Sidna Umar had been attacked and was dying, before he died, he said, "I would have chosen one of two people to be the Khalif, but they both died before me. And so out of 6 people, I want you to choose who is the next Khalif." And by this process, Sidna Uthman was chosen as the Khalif. So there's no democratic vote here. Then when Sidna Uthman was murdered, not having, very suddenly and unexpectedly, not having appointed any successor, people came to Sidna Ali and they said, "You should be the next Khalif." He said, "Who are you to say? Ask the people of Badr, who are still alive." What did he mean by this? He meant, ask the people of knowledge, ask the best of you who should be the Khalif. And they had shura, and then they agreed, yes, it should be Sidna Ali. Then he accepted to be Khalif in a very difficult time. He had to fight against the Khawarij, as we know, just as we have today the Khawarij manifesting again, because they never disappear from the picture. And then if we go further on, if we go to the first fitna, when really there was civil war, as the Prophet had foretold, sallallahu alaihi wasallam, we find that people were giving bay'ah to Abdul Malik ibn Marwan in Medina, and they were giving bay'ah to Abdullah ibn Zubair in Mecca. And there was this tension, who should be the leader of the Muslims? And they both sent messengers to the people of knowledge of that time. And they said, please, support us, because they knew if they were supported by the men of knowledge, then everyone would follow them. And so, for example, Imam Malik ibn Anas and Sayyid ibn Musayyib, who were two of the greatest ulama of the time, they said, we will follow the majority. In other words, they didn't choose either one. They said, we will follow the majority. So here, you have an echo of what we see in modern democracy, that whoever has the majority support will be elected as the leader. So Abdul Malik ibn Marwan was chosen as the next Caliph. And then after that, we have a series of dynastic rule, because what happened was that after Muawiyah was made Khalif, he then chose his son to succeed him. This was the first time that there was dynastic rule amongst the Muslims. And it means that in time, someone who is not fit to rule will become the ruler just because he's the son of his father. It always happens. And if you look at Muslim history, again and again, you see the same pattern of dynastic rule lasting for so many generations, then it collapses, and then someone else comes and takes power, and the whole story repeats itself. And what we see in this process was that if we come to the last, if you like, of the dynasties, the Ottoman Caliphate, which was so mighty in its inception, but which became corrupted and became in debt, because this coincided with the time of the European colonial era. And the Europeans, when they colonized the Muslim lands, they displaced the governments by Sharia, and they replaced it by their form of government. And they ruled it as a colony. And then fast forwarding, I'm having to cover a lot of ground in a very short time. If you go fast forward, when the time for independence came, they only gave independence to the country once it was enmeshed in the international banking system, once it had a national debt, once it had a currency that could be devalued. And so we saw from the talk that Sheikh Umar Ibrahim gave yesterday that the silver rupee had value, and the paper rupiah today is losing value all the time. And so just by manipulation on the money markets, any currency can be devalued very easily. And this means that a country that is rich in natural resources can be exploited for nothing. Because what happens is the banking system says, well, we'll lend you the money to develop your country, but we want you to grow this crop and this crop and this crop, we want you to mine this mineral and that mineral, and then we'll buy it from you. But they buy it for nothing because they've devalued the currency. And then because they're charging interest, and not only interest, but interest on the interest, and interest on the interest on the interest, they have to take out another loan. So again, we have the same control mechanism that governed the countries of Europe, now governing the traditional Muslim lands. And then we bring into the equation another connection which just isn't always made, and this is the connection of oil. Because what happened was in 1920, Chaim Weizmann of the Zionist organization signed a treaty with King Faisal of Iraq, newly formed. The lines had just been drawn on the map, and he'd been made the king of Iraq. And he, on behalf of all the Arabs, agreed that he would not stop the creation of Israel, and in return, the Zionists would develop the oil resources of the Arabs. This was the deal. But then also part of the deal was that all oil would be bought and sold in dollars, in petrodollars. And this gave, if you like, the American currency an edge over the other currencies because it was backed by black gold, by oil. As we saw yesterday, America left the gold standard in 1973. This was the last country to leave it. Others had already left it earlier on. At that point, currencies just became commodities. They weren't tied to the value of gold. They could be bought and sold in the marketplace. Their value could be manipulated. But because dollar was connected to oil, this gave it extra value, if you like. And therefore, all the currencies came to be measured against the dollar. This was how America has exerted control over the world. And they have been very jealous to protect that. So, for example, King Faisal of Saudi Arabia, he said to Kissinger, I want to be paid in gold for the oil. I don't want to be paid in petrodollars. Kissinger flew out and met him in his tent in the desert, tried to persuade him. He wouldn't change his mind. Very shortly afterwards, he was assassinated on the Prophet's birthday, sallallahu alaihi wasallam. Similarly, if you look at Saddam Hussein, although we know he was a tyrant, he killed many Muslims, but what caused his downfall was that he started to try and sell oil for euros instead of for dollars. And at that point, the decision to invade Iraq went ahead, and eventually he was hanged. And he was hanged on the Eid al-Adha, on the day of sacrifice. So they were making a point, just in the same way that President Lincoln when he said, I will bring back the silver dollar, because the dollar used to be silver. I will bring back the silver dollar as a means of exchange in America. He was assassinated soon after. So you see, in fact, how strong the influence is of the banking elite. What has happened along with the independence is that traditional Muslim rule has been removed. We're still very lucky in Indonesia and Malaysia to have sultans and to have sultanates. But they're kind of in parallel with this new constitutional apparatus, with elections and parliament and, political parties, that in fact is used not to represent the people, but to keep control over them. Because, as Sheikh Abdul Qadir said in one of his books, the relationship between the bankers and the politicians is like the old Victorian household. The master would give orders to the butler, and the butler would pass on the orders to the servants below stairs. So the politicians are like the butler, and the master are the financial elite, and the people below stairs are people like us. Now, what is happening is that because of the riba that is so widespread now, especially in the financial system, because everyone is using paper money, and because money is being created out of nothing more and more, the whole financial system is going from one crisis to another. We saw that just a few years ago in America. We see it in every country from time to time. And you find that what happens is the politicians, their manifestos say, well, we will tax you the least. We'll tax you less than the other politicians to service the national debt. The control mechanism is the national debt. And it means they have to cut social services and direct all the money towards not paying off the national debt, but just to service it, to keep it alive. And then every so often with the so-called developing countries, when it becomes too impossible, they say, we'll give you another loan, we'll lend you the money to pay off the money you owe, and then we'll lend you some extra, and then you have another 7 years to pay it off, and it just gets worse and worse. So as we saw today with Dato Manap's presentation, you just see the national debt getting bigger and bigger and bigger. It's not going to get smaller. Now you say, well, what can I do? Just an ordinary Muslim in the street. What can I do to affect this situation? I know what the deen is. The muamala is so clear that money should be linked to gold and silver. We all know that. We all accept that. We all know that the ulama on the Sharia boards of the Islamic banks are paid to give the fatwas that the banks want. And we know that the Islamic banks are there to link into the main banking system so that the money and the wealth of the Muslims can be used to support the banking system. Because it is like a cancer. And the thing about a cancer is it not only destroys the body, its host body, but once it has gone so far, the whole body is destroyed. And then the cancer dies with the body. So it's like an end game that has no outcome unless. Because you say, well, surely there must be a remedy in accordance with the Sharia. It must be that if we have a deen which is completed, as the Prophet ﷺ promised us and confirmed, that there must be a remedy to this situation, this very extreme situation. And it's in his farewell khutbah. And I'll just read from that, if I can just find it quickly. It's towards the end of my paper. Part of his khutbah, the Prophet ﷺ said, "You will surely meet your Lord, and he will ask you of your works." There's no escaping that for each one of us, including the bankers. "I have told you, he who has a pledge, let him return it to him who entrusted him with it." And then this is the key passage. "All usury is abolished, but you have your capital. Wrong not, and you shall not be wronged. Allah has decreed that there is to be no usury, and the usury of Abbas ibn Abdul Muttalib is abolished, all of it." In other words, he just wrote it off. And although he mentioned the usury of Abdullah ibn Abdul Muttalib, he was referring to all debts. He said any money that has been created out of charging interest, write it off. If you borrowed 100 dinars, repay 100 dinars. If another 2,000 dinars is accumulated, write it off. Just remove it. Because it comes from nothing, and so it can be returned to nothing just as easily as it was created. And we find in this modern time, there's also this awful practice of the banks called quantitative easing. What they do is when the money supply is running out, they say, okay, we'll just add a large amount of money into the central bank account, and then we'll use that money to buy government bonds, and then the government will have more money. But what they do every time they create money out of nothing, it devalues the purchasing power of money. And so that is why we find that the rupiah buys less and less and less, not each year, but even each month. And we saw the example yesterday of the eggs. It was one big basket of eggs, and then it was a smaller basket, and then it was just a handful. This is what happens if you create money out of nothing, because it has no value. It is just a fancy design and a number on a piece of paper. And by Maliki fiqh, this is why you can't pay zakat on it, because zakat is done by weight. How many bits of paper do you have to weigh? It has to be, as Sheikh Umar underlined yesterday, it has to be in ayn, not in dain. It has to be in gold and silver. You can't even pay zakat with flus, with small change. Not permitted. And you can't use an IOU as a means of exchange. Not permitted. And I asked that question of Hajj Abdul Samad earlier on today because I was very much aware of the passage in the Muwatta of Imam Malik where someone came to Abdul Malik ibn Marwan and he said, are you permitting usury in the marketplace? And he said, Astaghfirullah, what do you mean? Because he knows the ayat that says Allah has made war. Allah and His Messenger have made war on usury. He said, what are you saying? He said, people are using IOUs as a means of exchange. And why is this forbidden? Because if I buy, say, a kilo of dates from Abdul Rahman, and he says, okay, it's 10 dinars. And I say, look, I haven't actually got the money on me. Can I just write you an IOU? I will redeem it. He says, okay, bismillah, pay me later. I write, I owe Abdul Rahman 10 dinars. Then Abdul Rahman has to go shopping. His wife suddenly said, look, we've got guests coming, we need food. Please get this, 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 and this. He goes to the shop, he says, look, Ahmad owes me 10 dinars, but he hasn't given it to me. But I have this IOU, and if you give the IOU to Ahmad, he'll give you the 10 dinars. Then the shopkeeper can say, well, I'd rather have the dinars, but if you want, I'll buy your IOU for 9 dinars. This is the riba. It's an unjustified increase because Abdul Rahman will get 9 dinars for the IOU, but this shopkeeper will get 10 dinars from me. So this is why it was forbidden straight away. And this was even when an IOU was backed by gold and silver. Now, as we've seen yesterday and today, it's not even backed by gold and silver. If you go to the bank and say, please give me my silver, they say, you must be joking. And as Sheikh Umar said, they'll send you to the psychiatrist. But this is the reality. The paper money is worth nothing. And all these complicated maneuvers that have been done by the Islamic banks to try and get around the prohibition of riba, you don't find any basis for this in the Sharia. You see, they talk about being Sharia compliant, but they should really be talking about being Sharia based, following the Sunnah. There's no doubt about the fact that the Prophet ﷺ used the dinar and the dirham as the means of exchange, as did all the early Muslims, right up for 13 centuries, right up until the Ottoman Caliphate. This was the reality. There was no question. People didn't even question it. And when someone asked Sheikh Ilish, can we pay zakat in small change or in paper money, when it was first being introduced? He said, no, you can't. And he gave the reasons. So even 13 centuries later, it was the same position as it had been in the time of Abdul Malik ibn Marwan. No doubt about it. So all you can do is feel sorry for the ulama who sit on the Sharia boards of the Islamic banks, because they aren't fooling anyone, or if they are, they may be fooling some customers, they're not fooling Allah and His Messenger. And they will have to answer for what they've done. But what they can do is they can say, yes, let us introduce the dinar and the dirham back into the system. Let us have dinar accounts, let us have dirham accounts. They can do that. And then they can have a proper transaction to help with any transaction, whether it's buying a house or buying a car or whatever. But until you have the means of exchange halal, the whole transaction is haram. It's as simple as that. The question I asked yesterday was, could you, because the point was raised that the Constitution says, oh no, you can only have rupiah, paper rupiah. I said, that law hasn't been around forever. Can't you change the law? Can't you change the law to say the rupiah must be silver? And it is possible, and this is something that can be done by petition. I, in fact, just before I came, I sent a petition to the Chancellor of the Exchequer in England, asking him really to save England by writing off most of the national debt, which is all the creation of compound interest. And I'll just, to finish off with, I'll read that, if I can find it. Yes, this was the petition I sent to the Chancellor of the Exchequer. It's called Austerity Measures for Compound Interest, Not for Taxpayers. Write off all of that part of the national debt that has been created out of nothing by means of the compound interest formula. Why is this important? The national debt is spiraling out of control. This applies to every country in the world without exception. The national debt is spiraling out of control as a result of the exponential increase in the deficit generated by the application of the compound interest formula to the original sum borrowed. The £1 million originally borrowed by William of Orange has now become over 900 billion. And then I give a link to the website, which shows it. Increasing taxation and cutting essential social services will never significantly diminish this steadily increasing deficit. Historically, countries drowning in usury have periodically freed their society from this quicksand by simply writing off the money that has been created out of nothing by means of the compound interest formula. It came from nothing and it has returned to nothing. The time to deal with the UK national debt in this manner is now. Whichever political party places this at the heart of its manifesto is sure to win the next general election, as well as saving the British Isles from economic and social ruin. And in fact, the people in every country could make a similar petition. It's not rocket science. It's a very simple solution to an impossible situation. And finally, I'd just like to finish with the fatwa that Sheikh Umar Ibrahim gave back in 1991 in Granada, Spain. Because at that point, he had just really begun his studies on the dinar and the dirham and on the muamala of Medina and of the deen of Islam. And it's important to see the clarity that he had then, that he has carried right through to today. And I'm sure as long as there is breath in his body, he will continue. So he wrote, therefore, having gone through all the proofs, therefore we declare a fatwa in Granada for all Muslims by which, after examining all the aspects of paper money in the light of the Quran and the Sunnah, we declare that the use of paper money in any form of exchange is usury and is therefore haram. It is not permitted for the Muslims to accept or to give paper money in a commercial transaction. It is an obligation on the Muslims to abandon usury and to introduce new media of exchange or money. And the best way is to follow the Sunnah of the Messenger of Allah, sallallahu alaihi wasallam, by using gold and silver, or any other merchandise commonly accepted as a medium of exchange. So they're very clear. It rings through with the same clarity that it did all those years ago. And it's just a matter of the Muslims actually saying, we've had enough of this rubbish money Let's have real money. Let's actually embody the deen. Let us collect the zakat as it should be collected in gold and silver. Let us get rid of all the taxes which are not sanctioned by the Sharia. And then we will have a just society and a wealthy society. Bismillah.